Well, welcome back, everybody who was with us this morning. We had a nice, lively conversation about sustainability, a fairly broad-ranging conversation about sustainability. The panels probably will be just as broad-ranging. Maybe not. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see how they go. So basically, the purpose of the panel discussions is to explore this concept of sustainability as it relates to more specific areas in Ohio's landscape, namely our urban, agricultural, and forested areas. Big chunks of the state's economy rely on these three sort of legs, if you will, of the state. So it'll be interesting to hear the conversations that arise from this. We've invited experts from within Ohio to give their thoughts on sustainability and on how we get there, basically. They've been asked to consider several questions that will hopefully spark some good discussion. The questions are sustainability and how do we address those factors? Are there any policies Ohio is or isn't adopting that would make cities, in this case, more sustainable? And are private businesses, consumers individually or in aggregate playing a positive role in promoting sustainability? And can you give some examples? So we've asked our speakers to think about that. They don't have to stick to those things. I'm going to moderate the session. We're going to sort of flow through it and follow the conversation and try to ask some questions as we go. I do invite the audience, the participants who are from the audience, to ask questions at any time via the chat feature or the Q&A. I'll keep track of that, and we'll try to sort of take those questions and either ask them directly or synthesize a few of them and put a few of them together and ask them together. So part of this depends on you, the audience, to add in some questions of your own. And I invite you to do that again on the chat feature. I'll remind you of that from time to time. So the three panelists we have here for the first session are Jeremy Brooks. I'll let you read this. We're going to leave this up here for a minute or so for everybody to look through the three panelists. I'm going to ask them to also talk a little bit about themselves and add anything to this description they would like. But I don't want to take too much time talking through any intro material. I want to sort of jump right into it. We're going to go alphabetically. So Jeremy first, Walter, and then Brandy. Just sort of maybe starting out with this question of, what does sustainability mean to you? So Jeremy.
Great, thank you. Well, first off, thank you to Brent and Kelly for organizing this panel, and welcome to everyone out there that I can't see that's joined us for this. I appreciate you taking the time to listen in, and hopefully we have a nice conversation. So the sort of quick answer I have to the question of what sustainability means to me is that there are three sort of keywords that capture my conceptualization of it, and that is process, well-being, and trade-offs. I tend to prefer perspectives on sustainability that refer to it as a process. So Galopin has written about sustainable development, and he talks about it as the process of redefining progress, and suggests that what we're trying to sustain is the process of improvement of the human condition or the social ecological system to which humans pertain. So within this kind of perspective is the idea that sustainability is about identifying or creating or maintaining certain policies or lifestyles or practices that improve human well-being. And while doing that, also maintaining or improving environmental systems. But I think what's important is this perspective also emphasizes the idea that the collective act of identifying or creating or maintaining sustainable systems in some ways requires us to set new goals. And one of those new goals, I think, is based on having a better idea of what is really important for improving human well-being. And that's a sort of point that came home to me during some of my research in Bhutan, where they're really focused on this concept of gross national happiness. When it comes to process, I also think that this will be an adaptive process. It's going to be something that we'll sort of work through over time. And then lastly, I gravitate to perspectives that focus on trade-offs, and that's where I might deviate from that sort of common figure of the three overlapping spheres, which gives a sense that, it's easy to find synergies and alignment. But if for sustainability, if that's based on the idea that where we are now is not in a sustainable state, that will require change. And ideally that change will sort of result in synergies, but oftentimes changes, especially large scale changes, will result in sort of winners and losers. And so it's important to think about where those trade-offs will be and how to manage those, right? So just in short, I tend to think of sustainability as being an adaptive process of shifting our societal goals, and in doing so, attempting to improve human well-being, and to approach the ideal of finding the overlap between economic and social environmental spheres, but also being attentive to identifying and managing the trade-offs that are likely to emerge as we try to approach that ideal. So I'll wrap it up with that.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeremy. Walter.
All right, I think I'm going to give a little different perspective given my background, not in academia or even sustainability for that much, but I'm basically coming at it from someone that's lived in a city in Dayton in the city of Ohio for multiple years. What I see with sustainability, especially with cities, is that they need to continue on. And we've watched, especially here in the Dayton area, a city that was very vibrant, and because they were economically dependent upon one particular industry, being automotive, they crashed. They crashed during the financial crisis. You know, in 2008, the city was deemed one of the top 10 most likely dying cities in the United States. So we've then seen a comeback. And part of that is, you know, the city has taken an approach, and by city, I mean the government, the business, and the residents have taken an approach that we need to diverse our economy, we need to diverse our assets in the city, and we need to just diverse our entire thinking on how we go forward if we want this city to continue to move along, to progress, to become a desirable place to work, live, and play. So I think it needs to be looked at for sustainability, especially in a city. And like I say, I can relate to Dayton, that it needs to be a holistic approach, because doing one thing will create impacts on other integrated parts that make up the city. So I think that's about it from my standpoint.
Thanks, Walter. Brandy.
Yes, good afternoon. Hi. I think the previous panelists made some really great points there, and I think it really brings everything together from different perspectives. Really appreciate that. From my perspective, pretty similar in a way. It means to me that we can thrive as a community while still maintaining that balance of environmental, social, and economic well-being. When we think about sustainability, though, and thinking about the different landscapes across Ohio that we're speaking about, sustainability, air, water, there really are no political boundaries to air and water. So I see it as an issue that runs across all landscapes in Ohio, and there's a lot of common interests there that we have. There are some differences, but there is a lot of commonality too. And it's hard for someone to argue with wanting clean air and clean water so that they have their health and quality of life. I think it's really important with cities, especially though, cities are our centers for economic growth and development. And so we're going to be seeing different impacts in cities than we might see in other landscapes across Ohio. So just for some more context, Central Ohio is expected to be a region of about 3 million people in the next 30 years. So if we have that kind of growth in our urban areas, what does that mean for the strain that it puts on our public infrastructure, our natural resources, and our quality of life? So sustainability in the context of living in a more urban environment to me means balancing the needs of that growth and making sure that we're not leaving anyone behind in that process, that it's equitable. I think given the current public health crisis, to somebody else's point on the panel, we need to be nimble. I think we need to adapt how we approach sustainability so that it's not just something that's put on the back burner. that it's integrated into the work that we need to do to keep our communities healthy and to recover from this COVID-19 public health crisis. Um, and I think collaboration across communities and across regions is really important to really support that work. So thank you, Brent.
Thanks. I took a lot of notes. I really appreciate the insights from the initial sort of discussion there. And I think I heard a lot of things that were quite similar across what the three of you said. This idea of a process, I heard that come up. I think all three of you really brought that up. The question of distribution and that different people are affected differently by either by sustainability or the circumstance of the economy or the circumstance of the environment. Diversify. Walter, you brought up the question of, is a city too dependent on one thing and the need to diversify in order to maybe make it more resilient? And nimbleness. Brandy brought up the concept of nimbleness and collaboration. I think all those, to me, sound like really interesting things. I guess one of them I'd like to sort of explore a little bit more is this question of diversify. And if you could think of, from your own perspectives, ways in which you can encourage a city or a community to diversify effectively, if that's a really important quality of sustainability, how can we encourage diversification? And I'm thinking in the sense of, if one thing is going really well, if a community is really growing strongly, say Central Ohio is growing to 3 million people, maybe it's focused on a single industry or something like that. I don't think it is, but just say, for example, it was, how do you push that community to start to diversify or to think of diversity and diversification as a really important quality? So I'd like to just maybe start with you, Walter, to talk a little more about that diversification, if you could.
Yeah, it's something you'd like to see organically produce, but in a lot of cases, you need to actually have a plan and a focus to be able to diversify. You need to be welcoming, obviously, whether it's inviting new business, you need to set up support mechanisms. If it's diversifying culturally, you need to have different aspects brought into it so that you understand it and you're welcoming and inclusive. If it's diversifying your assets, whether they be natural resources or entertainment venues, you need to understand what the market is, what people want to do, where they want to go, what they want to actually experience. So it's done differently depending on what it is you're trying to diversify, obviously. Here we've seen, business-wise, again, we've seen our dependence upon automotive industry kind of get put to the wayside. We still have some of it, but we also have Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is a military installation that is very diverse in what they do there on the different missions. It has 30,000 employees inside the fence, which makes it an economic driver. But what comes out of that is the diversity of products and services, because they develop some inside there. Then they have folks that come out of there and they actually commercialize those products and things. What that has done then is brought diversity into our downtown in economics, where there's incubators set up, there's small businesses where folks were in the Department of Defense, they came out of it, they took a concept there, they figured out commercially how to market it, how to develop it, and they moved it forward. So we're seeing it kind of happen organically, yet we have some structure in place to help support all those different groups. So
That's fantastic. Thank you. So so if I can move to Brandy, I mean, you're part of a regional planning organization. What role do you play in this concept of diversity? Do you see diversification as an important concept or component of sustainability first? And then, what role does your organization play in sort of, I don't know, elevating that, enhancing it? I don't know what the right word is, but what role do you guys play in that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's a really important part of our work at MORPC. We serve a broad region of 15 counties. So there's a lot of diversity across communities, across landscapes. We have urban, suburban, and rural areas that we're engaging in our work. And those communities are members of MORPSI because we're able to convene them in a way that we can all come together and represent common interests in Central Ohio and advocate for Central Ohio communities. That diversity is really key to shaping how we move forward in our work. And speaking to diversity in terms of how we approach sustainability, um, both cultural diversity, economic diversity, diversity in our natural resources, diversity in our energy sources and transportation choices, I think all need to be present. If we rely on one single source of, whether it be, for example, energy, if we don't have a diverse portfolio of energy options, what happens when there's an outage? What happens when there's a disaster? It helps us to be more resilient. The diversity in transportation choices as well. People get around in different ways around Central Ohio. So having all of the different choices available, whether it be through biking, walking, transit, or taking your car, we can have more sustainable options available. So when we talk about diversity, not only in the people that we're engaging and the perspectives, but also the options that we're given.
I love it. That's great. Thanks. I mean, as I was listening to Walter and Brandy, I couldn't help but to go back to to Jeremy. I'm sorry, this class that we teach on sustainability, and I have this picture in my mind of an ecosystem that you put up every year, and talking about in the context of just a bunch of animals out there in an ecosystem, how it's affected by how it's been affected by humans, and it changes one piece of it that has an effect on other pieces. And it sounds like the same concept applies to people. And I know you've traveled around the world and thought about this in different contexts. I mean, is this a ubiquitous concept, the idea of things being connected like that and needing to have the diversity to make it stronger in a sense? I mean, is this both an ecosystem thing, a people thing, and is it a universal people thing? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that is the case, that we're finding out that some of the principles that we know about how ecosystems work well can apply to social systems as well. And interestingly, so a class I was teaching this semester on coupled social ecological systems, there is an emphasis on diversity there, and in this space where you sort of bring together sustainability and resilience. But there's also this balance between both in social systems and in ecological systems between diversity and sort of redundancy and functional redundancy. So you want diversity for new ideas, new approaches or variation alternatives when shocks hit. And we're all sort of painfully aware of a current major shock that we're going through. So having sort of alternatives built into your system is important. But you also want some of that redundancy, so that just to maybe, I don't know as much about Dayton obviously as Walter does, but if you have some redundancy within certain sectors of the economy, that one actor, if one actor falls out of that sector for some reason, you still have other actors in that sector. If one supply chain is cut off, you still have sort of redundancy there. So you need diversity, I think, but you also need some sort of redundancy built in at the systems level. But more broadly speaking, I think the various cultures that I've interacted with in different parts of the world, there does seem to be this sort of commonality of interest in diversity and heterogeneity, and the importance of different worldviews, different knowledge sets. As an evolutionary thinker, that diversity, that variation, that's the sort of material that natural selection acts on. So we have diversity in our genes that allows us to evolve in a biological sense, but we also have diversity in cultural traits and ideal systems and economies. And those are all important for this sort of evolution and ability of our social systems to be resilient and to react to change. So yeah, I do think it's a pretty common theme in my experience, at least.
Thanks. Any other further comments or thoughts from Walter or Brandy? I want to follow up though. We had a great question from Ian that really fits in here to this conversation, and it's about this, this thing we call Ohio, right? And this is a state that's got 3 major urban centers, a lot of other decent-sized urban centers, Dayton, Toledo, et cetera. And it's got this continuum between the sort of urban and rural area, which is pretty unique, I think, within the US. It's probably hard to find a similar example. It's got the southeastern part of the state and the northwestern part of the state. And it's got really interesting sort of continuums. And, we've got this idea of diversity and redundancy, but, to what extent does, does this, I don't know, Ian phrased it as a tension between rural and urban interests in the state, and maybe it's a benefit because it's a diversity. I don't know, so I'd like to get your perspectives on that. Given that we have this interesting continuum across the urban to rural areas, is that a benefit to us? Is it a harm? What is it for us? With respect to sustainability. Let me go back to Walter. How about we'll start?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Start off with Ian. That's a great question. And during the pandemic, I think we're seeing some of this tension that you're referring to. But I view it almost as a great choice. If I come to live in Ohio and I have to work in a large metropolitan area, within a short drive, short commute, I could live in a small town and feel like I'm out, isolated from a lot of things that go on in a larger city. So I think that's kind of a benefit we have in Ohio. And when we sell Ohio through economic development, that's one of those things we offer is a diverse background of folks' mindset, the mentality they have for work, yet with all the great attributes of a large city being close by that you can access those amenities. So I think it's a good thing we have, and we really need to promote that as we go. Things have changed a lot in the last 6 months. I could tell you that workforce development was a huge thing, attraction of talent, things like that 6 months ago, because a lot of the employers were striving to find people to fill the jobs they had. Things have changed since then, but we were able to offer that in Ohio because we have such a large population, and a company could locate somewhere near a big city and yet draw workforce from out in the smaller areas. So I think it's a good thing. You can have kind of the best of both worlds.
Yep. Brandy, any thoughts?
Sure. Excuse me. I think those were some really good points. I was thinking along similar lines, really. I think that it gives people a lot of really good options for how they'd like to choose to live their lives. And I think with that diversity across our communities, going from urban to suburban to rural, we share a lot of the same values. I think it might manifest in different ways. And with regard to sustainability, I think it's just a matter of how we talk about it to different audiences and how we can apply it to what's important to different communities. So when you think about that, in an urban area versus an agricultural, a rural area, obviously you're going to see the economy driven more in different ways. And so there's going to be different perspectives and different things that people might value. So it's just a matter of bringing people together, talking about it with a common language, and bringing people along. so that they understand the connections and how sustainability can support your quality of life, no matter where you're from, no matter where you live, it can make sense. So that's what I would add to that.
Thanks. Now, that was interesting when you said that last line you had there. I was writing it down. I'm sorry, it took me a second to get there. Was sustainability can make sense to everybody, and part of it's in how we define it. So I wanted to ask Jeremy in particular on that, because I know you participated in some different efforts to improve sustainability in Columbus, and seen some successes and failures. I mean, so what I mean, does that make sense to you, that this concept of you can define it in a way that it makes sense, and how does that play out when you're actually trying to do it on the ground, in your thought?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it does make sense, and I tend to shy away from the idea that you need a one sort of clear definition of what sustainability is. And I think to Brandy's point about sort of connections, and to Walter's point about diversity, there are different needs in different types of communities, and the trade-offs that will emerge and surface as discussions around sustainability progress will be different in different communities. So it's a matter of understanding what the needs and what those trade-offs will be in different contexts, and having conversations among the people in those contexts to sort of reach a shared understanding. And similarly, there will be different understandings or different factors that contribute to well-being in different contexts. Urban dwellers may have a different set of factors that are critical for their well-being, and people in rural environments may have another set of factors. And so if you try to sort of paint with too broad a brush, then you're missing some of the important nuances in different types of communities in different contexts. There was another part of that question. It's sort of more specific examples from Columbus about sustainability. I think one sort of quick example, I'm doing some work with folks on the large scale, the Blueprint Columbus stormwater management green infrastructure program in Columbus. And at its core, it makes a lot of sense to try and address a challenge with a more environmentally sort of oriented strategy. So using green infrastructure, rain gardens, permeable pavements, other strategies to manage stormwater, because there are additional potential benefits that come with that you wouldn't get from traditional gray infrastructure approaches. The biggest challenge, in my understanding, with all of this has been bringing the community along and helping them understand the potential benefits, working with them to understand their concerns, to address those concerns. And so it's really been, from my understanding, and there are other people that are more involved with this on a day-to-day basis, but this hasn't been a technical challenge. It hasn't been, I mean, certainly there are technical challenges involved. It hasn't as much been an economic challenge or a policy challenge. It's been a social challenge of understanding what are the values of the people in the neighborhoods that we're working in, and how do we bring everyone together to sort of have a common understanding of what the goals are, and how we see this type of policy and program benefiting people economically in terms of property values, benefiting people environmentally in terms of cleaner water, potential better sort of habitat, aesthetic improvements, and benefiting the environment through, benefiting people socially by creating a sort of common identity in a neighborhood and a community. And those are some of the issues that we're trying to work through. But those, the specifics of how that plays out can be different, not only across a rural to urban gradient, but even within different communities within the same urban system. So, you do have this urban to rural gradient in Ohio, but you also have that sort of diversity of understanding and values within different neighborhoods in the urban context even. So just additional complexity to deal with.
Yeah, thanks. It brings up the second general question that I had sort of sent to you guys, or we had sent to you guys to think about, had to do with the factors inhibiting sustainability. And a great point came up by Alina, echoed by Satya in some of in the chat, and it really has to do with, maybe a pre-COVID time, I don't know, but there was a lot of movement towards cities, really big cities. You have some really big central cities in the U.S. with really rising populations, and they have really increasing housing values and creating some big inequities amongst the individuals who happen to live there. Right? It's really, a lot of people living in a place called San Francisco that can't, or working in a place called San Francisco that can't even afford to live there because of the expense of it. So equity is certainly a really critical part of sustainability. So I guess the question is that something we're going to face here in Ohio? Is Dayton going to face that problem down the road? Is Columbus going to face that problem down the road where we're going to have some real big inequities? Maybe we already do, actually, right? And maybe they've been exacerbated, as Satya points out, by this COVID problem that we have currently. So I want to start with Brandy on that, and then we'll work back to Walter and Jeremy. Just sort of address this equity question and whether it inhibits sustainability and to what extent it inhibits it. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, these are all really relevant and good questions that I think everybody needs to be thinking about. And it's also a complicated question. I would say that equity needs to play a central role in the work that we're doing around sustainability. We can't separate it. Especially during the pandemic, it's really revealing a lot of the inequities in the current public health structures that we have in place, the economic crisis that people are facing very quickly, and that's likely to continue. So people and businesses are struggling, and governments are faced with the fact that they're going to have to cut their budgets as well. I think that the inequities when it comes to the environment that we're living in becomes pretty clear when we see that those communities that are exposed to higher levels of air pollution happen to also be minority communities, also suffer the greatest consequences with COVID-19. So I think that's a really stark example of what you're communicating here and how we can address sustainability. We can't be tone deaf to that. People are struggling right now. And so I think the only way that sustainability can stay on the front burner right now is if we're making it part of the solutions that we're seeking. Integrating it into the solutions as part of our recovery through this pandemic. So, and I know there's a lot of leaders and public officials and sustainability practitioners out there that are all talking about this in similar ways in terms of, sustainability means that we're improving the quality of life in our communities. Part of that is having a healthy environment. When we're living in healthy environments, when we have clean air, when we have clean water, we're exposing people to fewer risks to their health. I think also we can use it as a strategy for recovering in terms of thinking about what are those economic opportunities that we can create using sustainable practices, using clean energy and energy efficiency, creating more green space, more green infrastructure to address stormwater pollution. So I think we just need to have that lens as we think about, how we can be resilient coming out of this. So thank you.
Great. Walter, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the inequities is a very difficult and complex piece of it. I mean, the examples I have here in our community, are obviously housing inequities. We're seeing a surge of new homes being built in the urban core in the central business district. And the price points have gone up into the $600,000 range. Yet within a mile or so, there's really blighted areas where there's a few left homesteaders with some burned out houses and vacant lots. And that's a tough gap to fill. You know, the income for those folks in both situations is what kind of leads them to where they're at. So that makes it tough. And we've also seen inequities with with food deserts. And we're starting to see some things. We have a co-op grocery being constructed right now. And it was well embraced by the residents around where the co-op grocery is going to be, to those other parts of the city, to the business community supporting the co-op grocery. And it was neat to see how the groups came together with different interests, yet they're all supporting one mechanism that'll help close some of that equity gap, at least in that small neighborhood. But it's going to be an ongoing thing, and the COVID situation obviously didn't help that by any means. It obviously probably made it worse, given the really brunt of the workforce impacted was the service industry, which were lower paying jobs. So it's something we're going to have to deal with as a community. You know, I don't think just a government fix will do it. I don't think that that you're going to mandate things to make it better. I think it's got to be a community effort to come together and realize what the situation is and realize the improvements made. Because as Brandy said, you know, you've got to fix that to make things sustainable.
You know, I want to jump in, and before passing the baton on to Jeremy, I want to switch. I like this conversation. I think this is part of the conversation. I want to switch it just a little bit because of something Walter just said. And so, you know, you talk about the co-op grocery, and you got lots of different interests sort of coming together. And, you know, this came up this morning, actually, in the conversation with three panelists there. And, you know, I'm intrigued by this idea, you know, that sustainability has this potential to be, you know, through a co-op or something like that, right? Or a bike trail, Walter, or something to be, you know, a situation that brings people together with common interests who wouldn't otherwise be together. We know we're in a situation right now where we've got a, you know, political system that, you know, people can't agree on anything, and they really go to the edges of extremity, even if they're not at the edges of extremity, right? They tend to do that for some reason. So, you know, sustainability potentially is one of those things that seems to kind of go that way, right? That, you know, if you're a person into sustainability, you're sort of put into a camp, and then you got the sustainability people here and the anti-sustainability people there. But the example you talked about is the opposite. It's an example where sustainability can bring people together. So, you know, I guess as I sort of looked at Jeremy to sort of think about this question of, you know, can sustainability be the thing to bring us together, or is it going to be yet another thing that's a partisan, you know, problematic thing that tears us apart, right? Like so many other things have. So Jeremy, with that, you know, speak.
Wow. I think, unfortunately, it's already sort of headed down the road of being another sort of hot button issue. That's your views on it are a function of your political identity in some ways. I hope that we're not so far down that path that we can't sort of pull back from that cliff, because I think Walter's right that it can and should be something that brings people together. How we achieve that, I'm not sure. I don't know how you rescue a sort of term or a concept from being sort of captured and polarized. But I think it is essential, and I think, you know, when it comes to that social sphere and the sort of common sustainability sort of diagram, there's so much that's captured in that. Whether it's sort of access to goods and resources, or educational sort of opportunities, or distribution of income, or racial or ethnic equality. Just there's so much that's captured in a bubble that it sometimes gets lost in the mix of the emphasis on environmental conservation and restoration and economic development, that social bubble just sort of floats out there. And it's really, as a number of people have noted already, is really been brought into stark sort of relief through the pandemic of understanding, how problematic the inequalities are when it comes to the sort of functioning of our society and the sort of equity of impacts. And, maybe like it took a sort of burning river to, in some ways, kick off a really more widespread awareness and understanding of environmental degradation. Maybe the inequities that are part of this pandemic that have really become glaring, not that they weren't there before, but this is maybe the river on fire when it comes to inequities in our system. Maybe that will cause people to reduce the polarization and realize that in many ways, opportunities for bringing people together can be a part of what sustainability is. I think sustainability often, the first thing that comes to mind to people is environment, that it's part of the environmental movement, but it doesn't have to be. It really can be part of all movements, economic, social, and environmental, and should be. So the degree that maybe we can harness this opportunity where the inequities in our system have become so painfully obvious, to emphasize those aspects of sustainability and use it as a tool to bring people together. I don't have anything more specific to say in terms of strategies for doing that, but I do think it's an important goal.
Yeah, I liked what you said, that sustainability maybe can be part of all movements. I think that's what you said.
Yeah.
And I like that. Maybe I'll steal that and use that in class next year.
Go for it.
So, this to me leads into the area of, what can we do? What can we do in Ohio if we think sustainability in all areas is really important, right? What are there any policies that we're doing or not doing? I mean, what policies should we do better, or do more of, or do more broadly? What policies don't we have here that we could, jump into and use? So I just want to ask the panel to sort of think about that and give us some. It shouldn't be a new question. You all knew it was coming. So maybe give us some thoughts on that. And I'll start with Walter, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think policies have a place. I'm not a big rules or regulations guy. But I think there are things that are out there that we should use more of, and we starting. And a good example is PACE financing. So if you're not familiar with PACE financing, it's property assessed clean energy financing. We're using it here in Dayton for several buildings. I know Columbus is using it quite a bit, Cleveland, where we're taking either blighted buildings and now putting them to good use, or we're taking existing buildings that are maybe not as energy efficient as they could be and using this financing mechanism to actually upgrade the efficiencies, change the fuel sources, insulate the envelopes better, put better windows in. And the fundamental piece of it is an investor in a building can do that. And then the cost of that gets built into their property taxes. It's based on a payback on the efficiencies. So the money you're saving doing these upgrades goes towards that biannual payment that's part of your tax payments. And it's really catching on here. We started with a district in downtown Dayton, and the rules are you got to be contiguous. So we've all of a sudden joined other jurisdictions because they want to do PACE financing projects. And it's just growing out, further out and out, away from the core of downtown Dayton. I'm more like those types of incentives or enhancements or ways to entice people to do the right thing when it comes to sustainability and energy and doing the right things in their neighborhood. So I think that works better than a regulated mandate that says you should do this or you have to do this and things like that. So I think I look at it more of and that's kind of a market-driven sense too, because it gives an investor or someone invested in the community another reason for them to do the right thing.
A quick follow-up, if I can, on that. I really like that. So what is the role say, of local governments in that. I mean, it seems to me like in, just my observation here in Columbus and in a few other places is that, yeah, we don't have to have huge policies or something like that, but, local governments play a really critical role in helping to, I don't know, facilitate a movement towards sort of more quote unquote sustainable activities like cleaner energy installations and things like that. I mean, you see a critical role, and it could be as easy as the local government can step back from imposing onerous regulations, right, and can help businesses move forward in the right direction, the quote unquote right direction. I mean, does this seem? I mean, is there a strong role for local governments in this, from your perspective, in trying to help promote sustainability?
I think local governments obviously play a key part because their community is unique. In some aspect, you can say all communities are the same, but that's not necessarily the case. Whether it's attitude-wise, whether it's geographics, whether it's how the community functions, they all operate differently. They could be adjacent to another one and they operate totally differently. So I think in their perceptions are different and their attitudes and wants are different. So I think it's an important piece to have the local jurisdictions kind of weigh in on those things. It's just, I don't feel that putting laws in place to try to force you to do sustainability are going to be beneficial in the long run. I mean, if it makes sense and it gets to the goal, people should agree to that and understand that and move towards that. So yeah, I think local plays a major portion of that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said with respect to how important regulation is, or not having regulation is potentially, because that was a real thread as I got from this morning's conversation, was that, and you even had someone from the EPA there who was saying, really, regulation can't get ahead of people. So unless people want something, it doesn't matter what we do with regulation. It's not going to get ahead of where the people are in terms of what they want. And I think that's kind of what you're saying there is like, let's get the people to where, they want, let's help people understand why we need this and maybe move towards it before we, put this big heavy hand of whatever in place.
Yeah, the education piece for the residents, for consumers, that's the most critical part, because they don't understand, like he was mentioning this morning, Chris was talking about, it used to be your Diet Coke can went in a special trash can. But people never really understood why they did that. They just did it because they were told. But I think now with as much information as we can gather from different sources, sometimes we don't get the best information because it's coming from a wide variety of sources. But I think if you can educate people in the proper reasons why we should do things and where we're going to go, I think they would buy into that.
Whoops. Looks like I was talking without being heard. Brandy, you're right at the epicenter of this. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Hi, I was waiting for that question where we could talk more about local government. So thank you. Really, when you think about it, cities and local governments are at the forefront of a lot of sustainability work and initiatives to address climate change, clean energy, reduce waste, especially in light of, I think there's not as much leadership at the national level to drive sustainability work. So in light of that, MORPC does have a voluntary program for our members called Sustainable 2050. And Sustainable 2050 allows governments to commit to common sustainability goals. And through that program, they can go through a process to receive recognition based on the activities that they're doing to further sustainability in the community. And so it's really exciting to see how much momentum we have going on at the local level that we may not be seeing anywhere else. And it's really exciting that our local governments are moving forward in that way. So we have, I mean, for example, you know, communities like Bexley, which is kind of a rare community, is offering curbside composting services. Um, there's just a lot that our local communities can do, and a lot of local policies that they can set to make sustainability a priority. And so I think we're really proud of that in our region and the way that we can bring local governments along in this effort.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's come up in the last two responses. So I'm not sure what more I can add. I'm actually looking at a couple of the chat questions and trying to think about ways to integrate those questions in with this, some of the responses so far, and the broader question of sort of regulation. I will say that prior to teaching with Brent, I had been more of a regulation and rules sort of person, and he's had an impact on me for better or worse through co-teaching. So I have come to appreciate more the approaches that incentivize and sort of nudge as opposed to more heavy-handed approaches. And I think that tends to work really well for a lot of challenges. I still think that there is, I don't want to sort of absolve government of the role that they can play, not just through incentives and nudges, but through regulation when it's important. But it's a matter of sort of identifying those cases where regulation really is critical, whereas other strategies might be more effective. And I wonder how much the issues around inequality are ones that really do require more of a regulatory or heavy-handed approach. Because if you just sort of leave it up to individuals or communities, if you leave it up to things to organically sort of grow into a more equal society, I don't think we have a lot of evidence that happens very often. And just looking at one of the chat comments here about the history of pandemics, the idea that in previous pandemics, people became more interested in sort of contributing to the public good or more open to the public good, but then tended to revert back to previous norms. And is there a reason to believe that this time could be different based partly on our expectation of climate change? And I think this is one of these really interesting cases. And Brent, feel free to put me on mute if I start to ramble, but where, you know, our understanding of behavior and governments would suggest that you really do need a top-down approach when it comes to climate change, because it's an issue that crosses national boundaries and state boundaries and local boundaries. So leaving it up to communities is not going to solve this sort of collective action challenge. That's what the sort of literature would suggest. But what we tend to be seeing in practice, as Brandy and Walter have both noted, is that a lot of the action even on an issue like climate change is happening at the state and municipal and local level. And it's really sort of contrary to what you might expect. And that does maybe give us some hope that with the emphasis on sort of local action, that maybe that's where you could see some more long-lasting movement. But I think what's needed for any sort of movement towards contributing to the public good that might emerge from the pandemic to be more lasting is some kind of like touchstone in leadership to reinforce it. And at the national level, we're not getting that. We sort of, I feel like we're a little bit adrift. At the local level, it's challenging because of distance. So you can't have large community events to sort of build identity and build sort of shared understandings of the public good. So as we come out of this and have opportunities to sort of congregate again, hopefully that can be part of the message to sort of encourage us to keep the public good in mind, and to link these sort of collective efforts that have emerged through the pandemic with other global challenges like climate change and other sustainability challenges that will require collective efforts to solve. So I think it's just to try and summarize what I was just blabbering about. I think there is this interesting combination of where you can have cases where top-down regulations, nudges, and Brent alluded to this as well. It's got to be a little bit of everything, and they can work in synergy, right? You have maybe incentives that get people to change behaviors in some way, that bring a common understanding of a problem, that leads to that awareness and education, so that then regulation can reinforce that at a later stage. In some cases, you might need some regulation to create a change in behavior and an emerging norm that sort of then gets reinforced over time. So you have these different pieces at different scales that can contribute to each other as things move ahead. So I'm going to stop now because I'm going to start to ramble.
All right, thanks. That was great. It leads into the last question. So, we've got 5 minutes left, 4 minutes left. Each of you have a minute, 90 seconds, something like that, to just sort of expound any last thoughts, but also think about this issue of how long do we have to wait, right? So I don't have an answer on this myself, but I'm just thinking of this so-called defined climate crisis, and we hear that we can't get regulation ahead of the people, yet the people don't seem to be to the point where we need the regulation to meet some big climate crisis, I guess. I mean, so how long do we have to wait? So that's my question to you: is if the issue is businesses, consumers, and people sort of push us along to sustainability, but it's a lot slower than a regulated system, do we have the time to wait? That's my question. The last one. Take it as you will, and say whatever you like. Thanks.
So I can start out giving you a little bit of energy perspective. So I worked for a utility in the 90s doing demand side management, energy efficiency. And now I took a break and went back to the building construction world. And now I'm back in the energy business. I can tell you that the corporate attitude has changed a lot. I can see that, at one point they kind of dug in and we're not going to change. And, we were going to produce electricity from coal, from power plants. And that's the way we were going to do it from then on. That attitude's changed dramatically. I think our integrated resource plans have all gone out 25 years, and they pretty much show us getting away from coal as soon as possible, moving on to either transitional fuel or renewables. We're seeing more and more of that. More utilities see that. You got to remember the energy industry has changed, maybe at a glacier speed, but it has changed. Steam used to be the energy of choice back when Dayton was an industrial boom at the turn of the century. Steam is long gone. And I think we're going to see, as new technologies come on and things move us into the future, you're going to see the energy sources change and go along with it. Back to your question, timing wise, that's tough to say. Again, I think it's going to happen more market driven and consumer driven, as opposed to mandated that we're going to have to change energy sources by this time frame, and things like that. So I look optimistically at it. I think it's a good model. It's worked for hundreds of years, and we're seeing it going to pay off in the long run for sustainability.
Fantastic. Thanks, Walter. Brandy.
Hey, Brent, my app crashed when you were speaking during that last part, so I don't know what the question was. I apologize.
That's okay. You can make up your own question. All right. No, so it's just how long do we have to wait for sustainability to really take root amongst everybody, businesses, society, people, etc. Just what's your thought on that?
Did you say how long do we have to wait?
Yeah, I kind of was trying to put it in the context of we have this this quote unquote climate crisis, and it's been defined that way, and it may take will it take 75 years for businesses to come around, people to come around, not just businesses, but the people they serve as well, to come around to the idea that we really have to fix this problem? Will it take 10 years? How long do we have to wait to really see this take hold?
Honestly, we should be accelerating our work as quickly as we're able to. That being said, I think there's a lot of different ways that we can address the urgency. And I think it goes back to our conversation about the diversity engaging diverse audiences, diverse communities, and having diverse solutions. So there's not going to be a one size fits all solution to the challenges that we're trying to tackle. Um, you mentioned business. There's going to be different market-driven solutions and technologies that are going to take us a lot further ahead than any government policies can take us. I also think we should have a good balance of market-driven and a regulatory framework to help support that and create some consistency in terms of expectations and where we're all headed, the direction that we're going. So again, it's not an easy question, but I think that there are tools that we can use right now to reach our communities, to reach the different audiences and the different sectors. And I think that public and private partnerships are really important in that space too. If we can come together, align ourselves around common goals and work together towards those goals, I think that if we can measure our progress in those areas, it's really important because you can't change what you can't measure. So if we can see that what we're doing is making a difference, I think that could accelerate the work. I also think that we can take some lessons from what we're experiencing right now with the pandemic. So although it's certainly unintended that we're seeing much cleaner air in our cities across the country, that wasn't intentional. That was a result of a drastic situation that we're in to respond to this crisis. But from that, how can we apply that to our sustainability playbook moving forward? We've demonstrated that significant impacts can be made to reduce emissions in a very dire situation. But how can we use that to accelerate our work? And how can we go about things in different ways so that we can create much more meaningful and impactful outcomes in our work? So being very focused in what's impactful and bringing in the right people and the right partnerships. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome. Jeremy, last thoughts related to that question or another.
Yeah, I appreciate that there's a couple of pessimists among the chat folks that are submitting comments. So that gives me a little bit more license to be pessimistic. I don't think we have any time to wait. We're sort of past time, but it's a matter of those trade-offs again, where we can be thoughtful and accept some short-term costs now, possibly through regulation, but through other mechanisms also, to make the transition through this, as we're sort of entering into the climate crisis right now, a little bit less rocky. Or we can wait and sort of let things happen organically, and it will just make the mess a little bit rockier. And I think we'll just have to rely on sort of adapting to the new climate normal as it becomes apparent what that is, and the uncertainties that are part of that. And that adaptation process will be more difficult the longer we wait. So I think if we are more thoughtful of taking action before things get really dire, the less dire they'll be. If we just wait to let things happen organically, maybe that's better in terms of people, individual level sort of, values and worldviews and beliefs. But it will make the adaptation process harder and less comfortable for everyone, I think. And I think there's a parallel with that we're seeing right now, in terms of how much of a roller coaster you want to be on through a chaotic time. So I think the same thing could happen at a much larger scale with climate change down the road. But but I don't, there's no good answer to it really. But I just think the longer we wait, the worse things will be and the harder it'll be to adapt. So, yeah. You're on mute again.
I was unmuted and then I muted myself. That was smart. So there's no one likes to end on there's no good answer, but we'll have to end there, unfortunately. But I don't know that there is a good answer to the questions of sustainability. So I didn't know what would happen in a session like this, and I really appreciate the three of you, digging in on the questions that we sent and thinking about them and chatting last week about them. And I think, from my perspective, having a great conversation. I mean, I got a lot of good nuggets here that I'm going to use, and I really appreciate it. And so, on behalf of my colleagues who helped organize the meeting, I really thank you for participating and for being panelists with us today. I'm going to clap on behalf of all the people out there and appreciation of you guys. And if I could give you this pen or a nice pen, facsimile of this pen, I would. I cannot, so far away, but in any event, I invite you to join us the rest of the day. To the rest of the folks out there who are hopefully going to join us, we have another panel coming up on agriculture at 2:15. That'll be moderated by Ian Sheldon, and invite you to stick around for that. So I'm going to sign off from this one, and thank you all. We'll take a few minutes of a break here, and have a great day. Thanks.